The elevator doors slid open with a polished whisper, revealing marble floors that gleamed like mirrors and walls, lined with awards that caught the morning light. Victoria Sterling stepped out, her cheap polyester blazer wrinkled from the subway ride, clutching a worn leather portfolio that had seen better days. She looked nothing like the woman who owned the 40-story building she now stood in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This was Pinnacle Industries, the tech empire she had built from a college dorm room 12 years ago. Today, she was nobody. Today, she was just another face hoping to blend into the crowd of employees rushing past with their coffee cups and important expressions. Today, she was about to discover what her company really looked like when the boss wasn't watching. The security guard barely glanced at her temporary ID badge as she shuffled through the turnstiles. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup deliberately understated, her entire appearance carefully crafted to be invisible. For 6 months, she had been planning this moment, working with a private consulting firm to create a completely new identity. Victoria Sterling, CEO, was supposed to be touring their European offices. Victoria Martinez, new marketing assistant, was about to start her first day at Pinnacle Industries. She had read the employee complaints, seen the anonymous surveys, heard the whispers about toxic management and impossible deadlines. But numbers on a page and secondhand reports could only tell her so much. She needed to see it for herself, needed to understand what was really happening in the company she had poured her life into building. The 23rd floor buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that made Silicon Valley fortunes. Developers hunched over multiple monitors, their fingers dancing across keyboards in a rhythm that never seemed to stop. Project managers rushed between glass-walled conference rooms, their voices carrying fragments of deadlines and deliverables. It should have felt exciting, innovative, alive. Instead, it felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath. Victoria found her assigned desk in a cluster of cubicles near the back of the floor. Her new supervisor, Janet, appeared moments later with a stack of training materials and a smile that seemed genuine but tired. Janet was in her 40s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too many new hires come and go. "Welcome to the circus," Janet said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know it can be overwhelming at first, but you'll get the hang of it. The key is to keep your head down and don't take anything personally. Sometimes the pressure gets to people around here." Before Victoria could ask what she meant, a commotion erupted near the coffee station. A young woman with tears streaming down her face was frantically trying to clean up what looked like an entire pot of coffee that had somehow ended up on the floor. Papers floated in the brown puddle and a laptop sat dangerously close to the spreading mess. "Oh no, oh no, oh no," the woman was saying, her voice breaking. "This is my presentation for the board meeting. This is everything I've worked on for 3 months." A small crowd had gathered, but instead of helping, they seemed to be taking a step back. Victoria could hear whispered comments about how someone was going to be in serious trouble, how the VP of operations would lose his mind when he found out. The woman looked around desperately for help, but everyone seemed too afraid to get involved. That's when Victoria saw him. Marcus Thompson didn't look like much at first glance. He was tall and lean, probably in his early 30s, wearing the simple gray uniform of the building's janitorial staff. His dark skin gleamed with perspiration, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that came from someone who knew his worth, even when others didn't see it. While everyone else stood frozen in social paralysis, Marcus was already moving. He appeared beside the crying woman with a mop and bucket that seemed to materialize from nowhere. His movements were efficient and purposeful as he began to contain the spreading coffee, but his voice was what caught Victoria's attention. It was gentle, reassuring, completely free of judgment. "Hey there, it's going to be okay," he said, kneeling beside her to help salvage the soggy papers. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she hiccuped. "Sarah Chen. I'm supposed to present this to the board in 2 hours and now it's ruined. Mr. Davidson is going to fire me." "I know he is." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as he continued working. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me. Do you have this presentation saved anywhere else? Email, cloud storage, anything like that?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I think I have an older version on my laptop." but it's missing the last week of updates. And my laptop was right there when the coffee spilled. I don't even know if it still works." Without hesitation, Marcus gently lifted the laptop and examined it. Coffee had splashed on the keyboard but hadn't seemed to penetrate the closed lid. He opened it carefully, and the screen flickered to life. "Look at that! Still working. And see this little indicator? Your files are syncing to the cloud automatically. When did you last work on the presentation?" "Yesterday, around 7 p.m., Sarah said, a flicker of hope creeping into her voice. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that could light up a room. "Then you're probably in better shape than you think. Let's get you cleaned up and find you a quiet place to work. I know exactly where you can reconstruct this presentation without any interruptions." Victoria watched in fascination as Marcus guided Sarah away from the crowd, speaking to her in low, encouraging tones. The other employees slowly dispersed, their crisis-gawking entertainment over, but Victoria found herself following at a distance. She told herself it was curiosity, but something deeper was pulling her forward. Marcus led Sarah to a small conference room on the floor below, one that Victoria realized was technically supposed to be reserved for senior management. He shouldn't have had access to it, but somehow he did. As he helped Sarah get settled, Victoria caught fragments of their conversation through the glass walls. "The thing about presentations," Marcus was saying as he adjusted the room's lighting to reduce glare on Sarah's laptop screen, "is that they're really just stories. You're not just showing data, you're telling people why that data matters. What story were you trying to tell?" Sarah's posture was straightening as she talked through her project. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that made people feel heard, asking questions that helped her organize her thoughts. Within 20 minutes, she was typing rapidly, rebuilding her presentation with a clarity and confidence that hadn't been there before. "How do you know so much about presentations?" Sarah asked during a brief pause. Marcus shrugged, a shadow passing across his face. "I used to do a lot of public speaking in my previous life, before I ended up here." There was a story in those words, Victoria realized. A story about someone who had clearly been much more than a janitor at some point. She found herself wondering what had brought someone with his obvious intelligence and leadership skills to be cleaning office buildings at night and mopping up coffee spills during the day. As the days passed, Victoria found herself paying attention to Marcus in a way she had never noticed service staff before. It wasn't just that he was good at his job, though he was. The office floors gleamed, the bathrooms were spotless, and somehow he managed to empty trash cans and replace supplies without ever seeming to disrupt the flow of work around him. It was something else entirely. Marcus seemed to know everyone in the building, not just their names but their stories. He knew that Jennifer in accounting was studying for her CPA at night and would leave encouraging notes about her upcoming exam taped to her computer. He knew that Tom, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. From IT was going through a difficult divorce and would slip him articles about co-parenting that he printed from the company library. He knew that the intern in marketing was struggling to afford lunch and would somehow arrange for extra sandwiches to appear in the break room on days when the kid looked particularly thin. More importantly, Marcus seemed to see things that everyone else missed. He noticed when Sarah started staying later and later, the dark circles under her eyes growing more pronounced each day. He noticed when David from the development team started snapping at his colleagues, the stress of an impossible deadline eating away at his usual good nature. He noticed when the office manager started crying in supply closets, overwhelmed by demands from senior management that seemed to multiply every week. And somehow, Marcus always seemed to know exactly what to do about it. Victoria watched him work with a growing sense of amazement and, if she was honest, shame. As the CEO, she had always prided herself on having an open-door policy, on being accessible to her employees. But she was beginning to realize that accessibility and visibility were two very different things. When was the last time she had actually seen her employees as people rather than resources? When had she last noticed when someone was struggling? The turning point came during her second week undercover, when Victoria witnessed something that would haunt her for months afterward. She was working late trying to finish a market analysis report that Janet had assigned her when she heard voices from the conference room across the hall. Through the glass walls, she could see Robert Davidson, the VP of Operations, berating a young man she recognized as Kevin, one of the junior developers. Davidson was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a voice that could cut through steel when he was angry, which, from what Victoria had observed, was most of the time. "This is completely unacceptable," Davidson was saying, his voice loud enough to carry through the supposedly soundproof walls. "We promised the client a working prototype by Friday, and you're telling me it won't be ready until next week? Do you have any idea what this delay is going to cost us?" Kevin, who couldn't have been more than 25, was visibly shaking. "Sir, I've been working 16-hour days for the past month. The specifications kept changing, and when I asked for help, I was told everyone else was too busy with their own projects. I'm doing the best I can, but I'm just one person." "I don't want to hear excuses," Davidson snapped. "I want results. If you can't handle the pressure of this job, maybe you should find something more suited to your capabilities. Maybe something in retail." Victoria felt her blood boil. She had never seen Davidson interact with employees directly, had always assumed that his gruff reputation was exaggerated. But watching him systematically tear down a young man who was clearly giving everything he had was making her physically ill. She started to stand, ready to march into that conference room and put an end to the verbal assault, when she saw Marcus appear in the hallway. The janitor paused outside the conference room, clearly hearing the same conversation that had drawn Victoria's attention. For a moment he just stood there, and Victoria could see the wheels turning in his mind. Then, with a subtle movement that she almost missed, Marcus knocked over his supply cart. The crash was spectacular. Cleaning supplies scattered across the hallway, a bottle of floor cleaner rolled into the conference room, and the sound echoed through the entire floor. Both Davidson and Kevin turned toward the commotion, their conversation interrupted. "Sorry about that," Marcus called out cheerfully, beginning to collect the scattered supplies. "These wheels stick sometimes. I'll have this cleaned up in just a minute." The interruption had broken the tension in the conference room. Davidson looked annoyed, but seemed to realize that continuing his tirade with an audience was probably not the best idea. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow," he told Kevin curtly, "and I expect better news." As Davidson stalked off toward the elevators, Kevin emerged from the conference room looking like he had just survived a natural disaster. Marcus was still cleaning up his deliberately created mess, but Victoria could see him keeping one eye on the young developer. "Rough day?" Marcus asked casually, not looking up from his work. Kevin laughed bitterly. "You could say that. I'm probably going to be looking for a new job soon." "What makes you say that?" "I can't seem to do anything right lately. Every project I touch turns into a disaster. Maybe Davidson is right. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this." Marcus straightened up, fixing Kevin with a direct look. "Can I tell you something? I've been working in this building for 3 years, and I've seen a lot of people come and go. You know what I've noticed about the ones who succeed versus the ones who don't?" Kevin shook his head. "It's not about talent, though you clearly have that. It's not about working harder, though I've seen you here until midnight most nights this month. It's about understanding that sometimes the system is broken, not the people in it." "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned against his cart. "Kevin, what you just experienced in there had nothing to do with your performance and everything to do with Davidson being under pressure from his bosses. He's got a board meeting tomorrow, where he has to explain why 3 major projects are behind schedule. Rather than admit that maybe those deadlines were unrealistic to begin with, it's easier to blame the people doing the actual work." Kevin's shoulders sagged. "So what am I supposed to do? I can't work any harder than I already am." "You're going to finish that prototype," Marcus said with quiet confidence. "But you're not going to do it alone. What programming language are you working in?" "Python, mostly, with some JavaScript for the front end." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I happen to know that Lisa from the DevOps team has some free time this week. Her project got pushed back because of budget approval delays. And there's a guy named Alex in the mobile development group who owes me a favor. Between the 3 of you, I bet you could knock out that prototype in 2 days instead of struggling with it alone for another week." "But Davidson said everyone else was too busy to help." "Davidson doesn't know everything," Marcus said with a small smile. "Sometimes you have to build your own support network. Let me make a few calls." Victoria watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 5 minutes, Marcus had managed to do what she, as CEO, had been trying to accomplish through expensive management consultants and team-building retreats for years. He had identified the real problem, provided practical solutions, and given a struggling employee both hope and a concrete path forward. But more than that, he had done it with a kindness and wisdom that seemed to come from some deep well of understanding about how organizations really worked versus how they were supposed to work. Over the following days, Victoria began to pay even closer attention to Marcus's interactions with other employees. What she discovered both inspired and horrified her. Marcus had somehow become the unofficial employee advocate for Pinnacle Industries. People sought him out not just when they had practical problems, but when they needed someone to listen. Someone to remind them that they had value, even when the corporate machine seemed determined to grind them down. He had created an informal network of mutual support among employees who had never spoken to each other before. The lonely intern now had lunch partners. The overwhelmed project managers had learned to share resources and cover for each other. The night shift workers, who had previously been invisible to the day staff, were now integrated into office social events and information sharing. Most remarkably, productivity and morale on the 23rd floor had noticeably improved since Victoria's arrival, though she was beginning to suspect it had nothing to do with her presence and everything to do with Marcus's quiet leadership. But it was what she overheard in the bathroom one Thursday afternoon that truly opened her eyes to the scope of what Marcus was accomplishing. 2 women from the HR department were talking at the sinks, unaware that Victoria was in one of the stalls. "I'm telling you, something has changed around here," one of them was saying. "The number of formal complaints has dropped by 60% in the last 6 months. Exit interview scores are improving. Even the anonymous employee satisfaction surveys are showing upward trends. What do you think is causing it?" "I have a theory, but you're going to think I'm crazy. I think it's Marcus." "The janitor? I know how it sounds, but hear me out. He's like this invisible thread that connects everyone in the building. He knows when people are struggling before their managers do. He somehow always knows exactly who needs help and who has the skills to provide it. It's like he's running an underground employee assistance program that's more effective than anything we've ever implemented officially. That's impossible. He's a janitor." "That's what I thought too, until I started paying attention. Last month, when Jennifer was having that crisis with her project timeline, somehow Marcus knew to introduce her to David from the other team who had dealt with the same client requirements before. When Sarah was struggling with her presentation skills, Marcus managed to connect her with Tom from IT, who apparently used to do training seminars in his previous job. It's like he has this mental map of everyone's skills and challenges, and he's constantly finding ways to help people connect." Victoria sat in the bathroom stall, her mind racing. What these women were describing was exactly what she had been trying to achieve through expensive team-building exercises and management training programs. She had been attempting to create collaboration and mutual support through top-down initiatives, while Marcus was building it organically from the ground up. But who was he really? How did a janitor develop such sophisticated understanding of organizational dynamics? How did he know so much about programming, presentation skills, project management, and a dozen other professional areas? That evening, Victoria decided to do something that probably violated several company policies and definitely crossed personal boundaries. She looked up Marcus Thompson in the employee database. What she found left her staring at her computer screen in shock. Marcus Thompson had been hired 3 years ago as part of the janitorial staff, working the night shift. His previous employment history was sparse, listing only a series of temporary manual labor jobs. His emergency contact was listed as his mother, living in a low-income housing complex across town. His address was a small apartment in one of the city's less desirable neighborhoods. But his educational background told a completely different story. Marcus Thompson had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford with a degree in computer science. He had an MBA from Wharton. He spoke 4 languages fluently. He had published papers on organizational behavior and artificial intelligence. Victoria stared at the screen until her eyes burned. This didn't make sense. Someone with Marcus's credentials could have walked into any tech company in Silicon Valley and commanded a 6-figure salary. Why was he working as a janitor? What had happened to derail such a promising career? She was so absorbed in trying to solve this puzzle that she almost missed the most shocking piece of information in his file. There, Buried in the middle of his emergency contact information was a note that made her blood run cold. Marcus Thompson was a veteran. He had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a communications specialist before his honorable discharge 4 years ago. Suddenly, pieces began falling into place. The way he moved with quiet confidence through chaotic situations, his ability to assess problems quickly and find practical solutions, his understanding of how hierarchical organizations really functioned, his instinct to protect and support the people around him. But it also raised even more questions. What had happened when he came home from his service? How had someone with his skills and credentials ended up in such an undervalued position? And what did it say about her company that they had completely failed to recognize the treasure that was working right under their noses? Victoria spent the weekend researching veteran employment challenges, and what she learned made her sick to her stomach. Despite legislation and corporate programs designed to support veteran hiring, many returning service members struggled to translate their military skills into civilian careers. They faced discrimination from employers who worried about PTSD or combat trauma. They often lacked the professional networks that helped other job seekers advance. They sometimes struggled with the transition from military culture to corporate environments. But more than that, Victoria realized, they often ended up in positions where their true capabilities were invisible to the people making decisions about promotions and opportunities. How many other Marcus Thompsons were working in her company, their talents unrecognized because they weren't in the right job categories to be noticed by management? Monday morning, Victoria arrived at work with a new mission. She needed to understand not just what Marcus was doing, but how he was doing it. She needed to learn from him, not as a CEO studying an employee, but as a student learning from a master. Her opportunity came that afternoon, when she witnessed Marcus handle a crisis that should have been impossible for someone in his position to solve. The crisis began, as many corporate disasters do, with a simple miscommunication that snowballed into chaos. A client had called to complain that the software update they had been promised was causing their entire system to crash. The update had been pushed live without proper testing because Davidson had insisted on moving up the timeline to impress the board. Now, 3 departments were pointing fingers at each other while the client threatened to cancel a multi-million-dollar contract. Victoria watched from her cubicle as the shouting match escalated in the main conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see Davidson berating the development team while the project managers tried to defend their work, and the QA staff insisted they hadn't been given enough time to properly test the update. Meanwhile, the client was still on hold, getting angrier by the minute. That's when Marcus appeared. He didn't enter the conference room where the argument was taking place. Instead, he quietly made his way to Kevin's desk, where the young developer was frantically trying to identify the source of the system crashes, while his colleagues shouted at each other 30 feet away. "Rough day?" Marcus asked quietly, beginning to empty the trash can beside Kevin's desk. "The worst," Kevin muttered without looking up from his code. "This update worked perfectly in the development environment, but it's destroying everything in production. I can't figure out what's different." Marcus glanced at Kevin's screen. "Mind if I ask what database you're using in production versus development?" Kevin looked up, surprised. "How did you know it might be a database issue?" "Lucky guess. I've seen this kind of thing before. We're using MySQL in development but Postgres in production. The client insisted on PostgreSQL for security reasons." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And I'm betting the database schema migration didn't account for the difference in how the 2 systems handle foreign key constraints." Kevin's eyes widened. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I helped set up that client's infrastructure 2 years ago when I was working for their previous vendor." The words hung in the air between them. Kevin stared at Marcus with new understanding, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" Marcus smiled sadly. "I'm whatever I need to be to pay the bills. Right now, that happens to be a janitor. But I used to be a lot of things." "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "About your background, I mean." "Because this company hired me to clean floors, not to solve technical problems. If I started acting like I knew more than I was supposed to, it would make people uncomfortable. They'd start questioning why someone with my background was willing to work for janitor wages. And then they'd either assume I was lying about my credentials or that there was something seriously wrong with me." Kevin was quiet for a moment, processing this. But you're helping me anyway, because you need help and I can provide it. That's enough. Within an hour working together, Marcus and Kevin had identified and fixed the database compatibility issue. The client's system was running smoothly again, the crisis was over, and Davidson was taking credit for the quick resolution. Marcus returned to his cleaning duties as if nothing had happened. But Victoria couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. Here was someone who could have been leading her technical teams, solving complex problems, mentoring young developers, and instead he was emptying trash cans because of a system that couldn't see past job titles and preconceptions. But more troubling was the realization that Marcus wasn't unique. How many other talented people were working beneath their potential because her company had failed to create pathways for recognizing and developing talent where it actually existed? That night, Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She was going to offer Marcus a position that matched his capabilities, regardless of how it might look or what questions it might raise. She was going to find a way to bring his underground network of support and mentorship into the official structure of the company. She was going to learn from his approach to leadership and apply it to how she ran Pinnacle Industries. But first, she needed to have a conversation with Marcus that would require her to reveal who she really was. The next morning, Victoria asked Marcus if he would meet her for coffee after his shift ended. She suggested a small cafe several blocks from the office, somewhere they could talk without interruption. Marcus agreed, though she could see curiosity and perhaps a touch of concern in his eyes. They met at 7 in the morning, after Marcus had finished his overnight cleaning shift. He looked tired but alert, and Victoria realized she had no idea how to begin this conversation. How do you tell someone that you've been lying about your identity while simultaneously trying to convince them that you value honesty and transparency? Marcus, she began, then stopped. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you react. He studied her face carefully. Okay. My name isn't Victoria Martinez. It's Victoria Sterling. I'm the CEO of Pinnacle Industries. Marcus didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there, coffee cup halfway to his lips, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but not surprised. I wondered when you were going to tell me. You knew? I suspected. You ask the kinds of questions someone asks when they're trying to understand how a system works from the inside, not when they're just trying to do their job within it. You notice things that most people in entry-level positions don't notice. And you have this way of watching people that suggests you're used to being responsible for their well-being. Victoria felt a flush of embarrassment. I thought I was being subtle. You were subtler than most executives would be, but I've gotten good at reading people over the years. It comes with the territory when you're invisible to most of the people around you. Why didn't you say anything? Marcus leaned back in his chair. Because I figured you had your reasons for being there, and they probably weren't malicious. And because I was curious to see what you would do with what you were learning. What I'm learning is that I've been failing my employees in ways I never realized. What I'm learning is that the most effective leader in my company is someone I never would have known existed if I hadn't been pretending to be someone else. And what are you planning to do with that information? Victoria took a deep breath. I want to offer you a position that actually matches your capabilities. I want to learn how you've created such an effective network of support among the employees. I want to understand how you've improved morale and productivity through relationship building rather than policy changes. And I want to figure out how to scale what you're doing so that it becomes part of how our company operates, not just something that happens despite how our company operates. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the cafe window at the early morning foot traffic. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Victoria hadn't heard before. Can I tell you why I'm working as a janitor instead of using my degrees? Victoria nodded. When I came back from Afghanistan, I had what you might call an adjustment period. Nothing dramatic, no PTSD episodes or anything like that, but I had trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, trouble relating to people who hadn't been through what I'd been through. I tried to jump back into the corporate world, but I kept feeling like everyone was speaking a language I no longer understood. He paused, organizing his thoughts. I had a job lined up at a tech company in Seattle. Good salary, excellent benefits, the kind of position that should have been perfect for someone with my background. But on my first day, I listened to a 2-hour meeting where 12 highly educated, well-paid professionals spent the entire time arguing about the color scheme for a mobile app interface. while completely ignoring the fact that the app didn't actually solve any real problems for users. That must have been frustrating. It was surreal. I had just spent 2 years in a place where every decision had life or death consequences, where the difference between good leadership and bad leadership was measured in whether people came home alive. And here were these people treating minor aesthetic choices like they were matters of national security. Marcus smiled, but it was a sad smile. I lasted 3 weeks. I just couldn't make myself care about things that seemed so trivial compared to what I had been doing. So I left, and I started taking temporary jobs, manual labor mostly, while I tried to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life. And you ended up at Pinnacle. I ended up at Pinnacle because I needed health insurance, and janitorial work offered benefits after 90 days. I thought it would be temporary, just until I found something more suitable. But then I started noticing how the place actually worked. Not how it was supposed to work according to the org chart, but how information really flowed, how decisions really got made, how people really treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. And you decided to do something about it. I decided to do what I could with where I was. I've learned that you don't need an official title to lead, and sometimes having an official title actually gets in the way of leading effectively. People tell the janitor things they would never tell their manager. People ask the janitor for help with problems they're too proud to admit to their colleagues. The janitor sees the real organization, not the version that exists in PowerPoint presentations. Victoria sat with this for a moment, recognizing the truth in what Marcus was saying. How many important conversations had happened around her without her knowledge? How many problems had been solved or crises averted by people whose contributions never appeared in quarterly reports? "So what do you think?" she asked. "About my offer, I mean." Marcus looked directly at her. "I think you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "You're asking whether I want a different job title and a bigger salary. But what you should be asking is whether you're ready to change how your company actually operates. Because if you're serious about learning from what I've been doing, it's going to require you to give up some control and trust that good things can happen without being mandated from the top down." "I'm ready for that. Are you?" "Because it means accepting that some of your best people might be in positions you've never thought to look. It means creating pathways for advancement that don't follow traditional career trajectories. It means measuring success in ways that don't always show up on financial statements." Victoria felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach, but also excitement. "What would you suggest?" Marcus smiled, and this time it was genuine and warm. "I suggest we start by having you meet some people you've never really met before, even though they've been working for you for years. I suggest we figure out how to make the informal support networks visible and sustainable. And I suggest we prove that a company can be both profitable and humane at the same time. When do we start?" "We already have." 6 months later, Victoria stood in the same lobby where her undercover journey had begun, but everything was different. The marble floors still gleamed, but now they reflected something warmer than just expensive lighting. The walls still displayed awards, but they had been joined by employee recognition boards and photos from volunteer events and mentorship program graduations. Marcus was beside her, no longer wearing a janitor's uniform but not wearing a suit either. He had designed his own role as Director of Employee Development and Organizational Culture, a position that had never existed before but had quickly become essential to how Pinnacle Industries operated. Together, they had implemented what they called the Underground Railroad model of employee support, officially recognizing and funding the informal networks that Marcus had been building for years. They had created mentorship programs that paired employees across departmental lines based on skills and interests rather than job titles. They had instituted culture ambassadors in every department, people who were trained to notice when colleagues were struggling and knew how to connect them with resources and support. Most importantly, they had changed how the company hired and promoted people. Instead of focusing exclusively on credentials and previous experience, they now looked for potential, for problem-solving ability, for the kind of emotional intelligence that Marcus had demonstrated every day as a janitor. The results had exceeded even Victoria's optimistic projections. Employee satisfaction scores were at all-time highs. Productivity had increased not because people were working longer hours, but because they were working more collaboratively and creatively. Turnover had dropped dramatically, saving the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in recruitment and training costs. But more than the metrics, Victoria could feel the difference in the energy of the place. People smiled more. They helped each other without being asked. They took initiative instead of waiting for instructions. They treated their work not just as a job but as part of something larger that they were building together. The transformation hadn't been easy. Some managers had resisted giving up control. Some employees had been skeptical of changes that seemed too good to be true. Robert Davidson had ultimately transferred to another division, unable to adapt to a leadership style that prioritized collaboration over intimidation. But the majority of the staff had embraced the changes, especially as they saw how the new approach created opportunities for growth and recognition that hadn't existed before. Sarah Chen was now leading the department's presentation skills workshops. Kevin had been promoted to senior developer and was mentoring other young programmers. Jennifer from accounting had completed her CPA and was heading up a new financial literacy program for employees. As Victoria and Marcus walked through the office that afternoon, Victoria marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. People were still working hard, still meeting deadlines, still building innovative products, but they were doing it in an environment that recognized their full humanity, that understood that professional success and personal well-being weren't competing priorities but complementary ones. "Any regrets?" Marcus asked as they paused by the coffee station where his journey as an unofficial leader had really begun. Victoria thought about the question seriously. The past 6 months had been challenging in ways she hadn't anticipated. Learning to lead with humility instead of authority had been harder than she expected. Admitting that she had been blind to problems that were obvious to others had been humbling. Changing systems and processes that had been in place for years had required patience and persistence that sometimes felt overwhelming. But regrets? No. None, she said. What about you? Do you miss the simplicity of just cleaning floors and staying invisible? Marcus laughed. Sometimes. There was something peaceful about working in the quiet hours when everyone else was gone. But I don't miss feeling like I wasn't using my full potential. And I definitely don't miss watching talented people struggle alone when I knew I could help but felt like I wasn't supposed to. They were interrupted by Tom from IT, who approached with a tablet in his hands and excitement in his voice. Marcus, Victoria, you need to see this. The anonymous employee feedback system just generated our quarterly report, and the results are incredible. 93% of employees say they feel valued and supported at work. 87% say they have opportunities for growth and development. 95% say they would recommend Pinnacle Industries as a great place to work. Victoria smiled, remembering the scores from a year ago that had prompted her undercover mission in the first place. The transformation had been real, measurable, and sustainable. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of kindness. When someone chooses to see potential where others see only problems. When leadership emerges not from corner offices but from genuine care for the people around us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.